You've been getting it wrong. Not because you're a bad person, not because you don't care, but because nobody ever gave you an honest, grounded framework for understanding how the woman in your life, or the women in your life, actually experience the world. What you got instead was a collection of contradictions. Women are too emotional. Women are manipulative. Women are impossible to understand. Just be yourself, but also be different. Listen more, but also be decisive. The advice has always been circular. The understanding has always been shallow, and you've been trying to navigate a complex human psychology with a map that was drawn by people who didn't understand it either. Here's what I want to establish before we go any further. This conversation isn't about scoring points. It isn't about winning arguments or finding some tactical advantage in relationships. It's about genuine understanding, the kind that makes relationships work, that makes communication less painful, that closes the gap between what someone means and what you hear. Because the gap is real, and it costs real things. Relationships, intimacy, connection. The kind of partnership that actually sustains both people rather than grinding them down. One important note before we begin. Everything we covered today describes patterns and tendencies, findings from research conducted across large populations. They are meaningful and practically useful. They are not universal laws. The woman in your life is an individual first. Use this as context, not as a conclusion. Today we're going through 10 psychological truths, grounded in research, honest about complexity, and practically useful. Not stereotypes, not generalizations that erase individual difference. Patterns, tendencies, the kind of information that helps you understand what's actually happening instead of reacting to the surface of it. And the first truth, the one that explains more arguments than almost anything else, is one most men have never had explained to them properly. Truth 1. Emotional processing and memory. Here's something that will reframe arguments you've been having for years. Research in cognitive neuroscience, including neuroimaging studies examining amygdala activation and memory consolidation, has found consistent average differences in how emotional experiences are processed and retained across genders. The findings vary across studies and individuals, but the pattern is documented and meaningful enough to be practically relevant. On average, emotional memories tend to be retained with greater detail and intensity in women than in men, and the connections between emotional processing regions and memory consolidating regions of the brain show different average integration patterns. What this means practically is this. An argument that happened 8 months ago is not equally available to both people in the room. To you, it may be resolved, filed away, processed, done. To her, the emotional texture of that argument, how it felt, what it meant, what it signaled about how you see her, may be as vivid and present as something that happened last week. This is not a manipulation tactic. This is not bringing up old stuff to win. This is a neurologically different relationship with emotional experience. She's not choosing to remember it that way. Her brain, on average, is built to retain it that way. The practical implication is significant. Resolution means different things for different people. For many men, resolution is logical. The issue was addressed, both parties agreed, it's over. For many women, resolution is emotional. The issue was addressed, both parties understood each other, the relationship feels safe again. These are two different definitions of done, and if you're operating on the first while she's waiting for the second, the argument never actually ends. Understanding this doesn't mean you're wrong for processing differently. It means you need a broader definition of what it means to actually resolve something with someone who processes emotion differently than you do. Truth 2. Communication styles. There's a reason conversations that feel finished to you feel unfinished to her, and it has everything to do with what communication is actually for. Research on communication patterns, extensively documented by linguist Deborah Tannen in her work on gender and conversation, identifies a consistent difference in how men and women tend to use communication as a tool. Men tend to use communication primarily for information exchange and problem solving. Get to the point. Identify the issue. Propose a solution. Done. For many women, and Tannen's research documents this pattern extensively, communication more frequently serves connection, processing, and relational maintenance alongside information exchange. For someone with this orientation, the conversation isn't just a vehicle for reaching a conclusion. The being heard is part of the point. The feeling of being understood by someone who matters is part of the point. Not always, not for every woman in every conversation, but frequently enough that missing it creates a consistent, predictable pattern of disconnection. Here's where the collision happens. She tells you about a problem. Your brain immediately activates solution mode, because that's what communication is for in your framework. You offer a solution. She seems frustrated. You can't understand why. You helped. She feels unheard. You can't understand that either. You listened and then solved. What she needed wasn't the solution. She needed to know you understood the experience of having the problem. Those are different things, and until you understand that they're different things, that being heard and being helped are not the same response, you will keep solving problems that weren't asking to be solved and missing the actual request underneath. The question that changes this dynamic completely is 4 words. Do you want advice, or do you just need me to listen right now? That question demonstrates that you understand the difference. That alone communicates more care than the most brilliant solution you could offer. Truth 3. Relationship needs and emotional security. Security is not a weakness. Let me say that again, because the way it gets talked about often implies that it is. Emotional security in a relationship, the need to feel consistently valued, consistently chosen, consistently safe, is a fundamental psychological need, not a female need, a human need. But research on attachment and relationship satisfaction consistently finds that women, on average, place higher emphasis on relational security as a predictor of overall well-being and relationship quality. Here's what emotional insecurity in a relationship actually produces: hypervigilance, a constant low-grade monitoring of signals, tone of voice, response time, facial expression, for evidence of whether the relationship is stable. This isn't paranoia. This is an anxious attachment system doing exactly what it was designed to do: scan for threat, maintain connection, protect against abandonment. And here's what most men miss entirely: the need for reassurance you sometimes observe, the questions, the sensitivity to perceived distance, is often not about the surface thing it appears to be about. It's about the underlying question that doesn't always get asked directly. Do I still matter to you? Am I still chosen? Is this still safe? You can answer that question with your words, but you answer it more powerfully with your consistency. Showing up the way you said you would, following through on small things, being present when you're present. These aren't grand gestures. They're the daily architecture of emotional safety, and emotional safety is what allows a relationship to actually deepen rather than just survive. Say this with me. Understanding someone's needs is not the same as being controlled by them. Because here's where it gets deeper. The next truth is one that most men underestimate, and that underestimation costs them more than they realize. Truth 4. Empathy, intuition, and social cognition. She knows something is wrong before you've said anything. She picks up on tension in a room before it's named. She reads the subtext of a conversation while you're still processing the text. And you've probably experienced this as uncanny, or occasionally as unsettling, without understanding where it comes from. It comes from a neurological difference in social processing that is one of the most consistently documented findings in cognitive science. Women, on average, demonstrate higher performance on measures of theory of mind, the ability to accurately infer another person's mental and emotional state. The mirror neuron system, the neural architecture underlying empathy and social mirroring, shows greater average activation in female brains across multiple studies. What this means practically is that she is reading more information from your face, your tone, your body language, and your behavior than you are aware you're broadcasting. The thing you thought you were hiding, the stress, the distance, the unresolved frustration, she already knows it's there. She may not know the specific content, but she knows the texture. And when you deny it, "I'm fine, nothing's wrong," You don't reassure her. You create a gap between what she perceives and what you're confirming. That gap is more unsettling than the problem would have been. This is why "nothing's wrong" said unconvincingly produces more anxiety than "I'm dealing with something at work and I need a bit of space to process it." The first sentence asks her to distrust her own perception. The second sentence validates it and gives it a frame. One closes the connection, the other maintains it while still giving you the space you need. Repeat after me. Being readable is not weakness. It's the foundation of real intimacy. But here's where the conventional narrative gets completely flipped, because the next truth about attraction and what women actually want in a partner is almost certainly not what you've been told. Truth 5. Attraction, confidence, and partner preferences. You've been told women want confidence, that they want status, that they want a provider, that looks don't matter to them the way they matter to men, that emotional availability is attractive, but so is unavailability. The advice contradicts itself at every turn. Stop. Here's what the research actually says. Attraction in women is, on average, more context-dependent and multidimensional than in men. Physical attraction matters. Studies consistently show it does, but it interacts with behavioral, emotional, and social factors in ways that make a simple hierarchy impossible. A man who is physically attractive but emotionally dismissive is consistently rated as less attractive overall than a man of average appearance who demonstrates emotional intelligence, humor, and genuine interest. The mirror neuron system, the neural architecture underlying empathy and social mirroring, shows greater average activation in female brains across multiple studies. What this means practically is that she is reading more information from your face, your tone, your body language, and your behavior than you are aware you're broadcasting. The thing you thought you were hiding, the stress, the distance, the unresolved frustration, she already knows it's there. She may not know the specific content, but she knows the texture. And when you deny it, "I'm fine, nothing's wrong," you don't reassure her. You create a gap between what she perceives and what you're confirming. That gap is more unsettling than the problem would have been. This is why "nothing's wrong" said unconvincingly produces more anxiety than "I'm dealing with something at work and I need a bit of space to process it." The first sentence asks her to distrust her own perception. The second sentence validates it and gives it a frame. One closes the connection, the other maintains it while still giving you the space you need. Here is the piece most advice completely misses. Emotional availability, genuine emotional presence, the ability to be affected by someone, the capacity to show care without performance, is one of the most consistently reported attractions in long-term partner research. Not neediness, not emotional dependency, availability. The sense that you are actually present in this relationship, that you actually feel things, that she is actually reaching someone when she reaches for you. The man who performs emotional unavailability as a calculated approach is misreading what actually builds lasting connection. He might create short-term curiosity, but he creates long-term emptiness for both people. And the women worth being with, the ones capable of genuine partnership, eventually stop reaching for someone who won't be reached.
Truth 6. Gendered psychological patterns and social roles. Here's where it gets more complex and more honest. Everything we've discussed so far involves patterns and tendencies, real, research-supported, consistently documented patterns. But patterns exist within a context, and the context is this. Women develop psychologically inside a social system that has placed specific, often contradictory demands on them for their entire lives. Be agreeable but have opinions. Be ambitious but not threatening. Be attractive but not vain. Be emotional but not too emotional. Be nurturing but also independent. Be available but have boundaries. These aren't abstract cultural observations. They are the daily psychological environment in which women navigate identity, self-worth, and relationship. The psychological consequence of operating inside contradictory demands is something researchers call role conflict, the cognitive and emotional cost of simultaneously performing mutually exclusive expectations. It produces a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from physical work. It comes from the constant management of how you're being perceived across multiple competing standards. When you understand this, really understand it, not just acknowledge it, it changes how you hear certain conversations. The frustration that seems disproportionate to the immediate situation often has a longer history. The sensitivity to being dismissed often comes from a lifetime of practicing being taken seriously in systems that defaulted to not taking her seriously. The need to be heard is often proportional to how frequently she hasn't been. This isn't asking you to take responsibility for systems you didn't design. It's asking you to understand the person shaped by them. That's different. And that understanding, that contextual awareness, is what separates men who genuinely connect with women from men who are perpetually confused by them. Truth 7. Identity, self-perception, and body image. Here's a number. Research from the American Psychological Association consistently finds that women experience significantly higher rates of body dissatisfaction than men, with some studies suggesting that over 80% of women report discomfort with their physical appearance at some level. 80%. That's not vanity. That's the psychological outcome of spending a lifetime inside a culture that has used the female body as a primary site of evaluation, judgment, and commercial exploitation. The beauty industry, the media, the social comparison dynamics amplified enormously by social media. These aren't background noise. They are constant, daily inputs shaping how a woman sees herself in the mirror. When she expresses insecurity about her appearance, and research suggests this is a common experience for the majority of women, regardless of how others perceive them, the worst response is rational argument. "You look great, you're being ridiculous." That sentence, however well-intentioned, invalidates the experience while addressing only the surface. It tells her that you don't understand where the feeling comes from, and it leaves her alone with it. What actually helps is presence without agenda, not reassurance as a transaction, "You look fine, can we go now?" but genuine, specific, unhurried acknowledgement of what you actually see and value. Not just physical, the whole person. The thing about her that has nothing to do with how she looks on a given day. That's what cuts through the noise the culture has been making in her head since she was 12 years old. And if the body image distress goes beyond what everyday reassurance can reach, if it's affecting her daily functioning, her relationship with food, or her ability to be present in her own life, that's when professional support becomes genuinely important. Understanding that distinction is part of knowing her well.
Truth 8. Stress, coping, and behavioral responses. You've probably noticed that stress looks different on her than it does on you. Not worse, not more, different. And that difference has a biological basis that explains more than most people realize. The classic stress response, fight or flight, was largely researched on male subjects for most of the 20th century. When researchers began studying female stress responses more systematically, they found a significantly different predominant pattern. Psychologist Shelley Taylor at UCLA identified what she called the tend and befriend response. Under stress, women more frequently move towards social connection and caretaking rather than withdrawal or confrontation. What this looks like in practice? When she's stressed, she may want to talk, not about solutions, but about the experience of being stressed. She may reach toward people she cares about rather than pulling away. She may process through relationship rather than through isolation. And if you, operating on a fight or flight model, withdraw when stressed, that withdrawal can read to her as distance, coldness, or rejection rather than as your natural coping mechanism. Neither response is superior. They're different evolutionary strategies. But understanding the difference means you stop interpreting her need for connection under stress as dependency, and she stops interpreting your need for space under stress as rejection. Two people with different biological stress responses navigating the same hard moment with completely different instincts about what to do with it. Understanding that is the beginning of actually being useful to each other when things get hard. Truth 9. The influence of life experience and individuality. Here's the most important corrective to everything we've covered today. Every pattern discussed in this conversation is a tendency. a statistical average across large populations, an identified pattern in research that tells us something real and useful about how gender interacts with psychology, biology, and social experience. It does not tell you everything about the specific woman in front of you. She has a history that preceded you, experiences that shaped her relationship with trust, with vulnerability, with communication, with her own body, with men specifically and people generally. She has had relationships that taught her things, some useful, some damaging. She has a family system that modeled certain patterns of love, conflict, and connection. She has a cultural context that intersects with everything we've discussed in ways that are specific to her. The research gives you a framework, she gives you the content, and the content is always more specific, more nuanced, and more important than the framework. The worst thing you can do with what we've covered today is use it to think you already understand her. The best thing you can do with it is use it to ask better questions, to listen with more context, to be less surprised by things that are actually predictable, and more curious about the things that are uniquely hers. Ask her, not as a researcher, as someone who genuinely wants to know. What does support look like for you when you're stressed? What does it mean to you when I do this? What do you need from me right now? These are not complicated questions, but they require the humility to acknowledge that you don't already know the answers and the genuine interest that makes her want to give them.
Truth 10. Modern cultural and socio-psychological dynamics. The world women are navigating right now is different from the world the research was conducted in, sometimes by decades, and that gap matters. Social media has compressed and intensified social comparison dynamics that already existed at damaging levels. The always-on visibility of other people's curated lives, their relationships, their bodies, their achievements, creates a comparison environment that has no historical precedent in terms of scale or intensity. Research on social media use and psychological well-being consistently finds disproportionate negative effects on women, particularly around body image, relationship satisfaction, and self-worth. The expectations on women have simultaneously expanded and intensified. The cultural script used to be narrower, limiting in its own ways, but at least internally consistent. The modern script asks women to be professionally ambitious and domestically present, physically optimal and body positive, emotionally available and personally boundaried, independently capable and relationally invested, all at once, without contradiction, without exhaustion. The exhaustion is real, and when it shows up in your relationship as irritability, as withdrawal, as a need for genuine partnership rather than one more thing to navigate alone, that's not her failing you. That's the cumulative weight of what she's carrying landing in the one place she feels safe enough to put it down. The most powerful thing a man can do in a modern relationship is be genuinely, practically present, not performing support, not offering it as a transaction, being it. The dishes done without being asked, the emotional check-in that's real rather than routine, the space to be imperfect and exhausted and not performing for anyone, including you. These aren't small things. In the context of everything else she's managing, they're enormous. What all 10 truths point toward? Pull back and look at the full picture. Deeper average emotional memory, communication patterns oriented toward connection, a need for consistent emotional security, high social cognition and empathy, attraction to genuine competence and presence, psychology shaped by contradictory social demands, a complicated relationship with self-image formed inside a critical culture, stress responses oriented toward connection rather than isolation, an individual history that makes her specific in every way that matters, and a modern context that asks more of her than any previous generation while offering a more complex set of contradictions to navigate. None of this makes women impossible to understand. It makes them human. Specifically, completely, sometimes frustratingly human in the same way you are, with a different set of tendencies, pressures, and experiences that produce different behaviors and different needs. The men who have the best relationships with women aren't
the ones who figured out a system. They're not the ones who read the most theory or mastered the most psychological frameworks as tactical tools. They're the ones who became genuinely curious about the specific person in front of them, who brought enough understanding of the patterns to not be constantly blindsided, and enough humility to know that the pattern was never the whole story. Understanding someone is an act of respect. It says, you are complex enough to warrant my attention. Your experience is different enough from mine to require that I actually learn it rather than assume I already know it. You are worth the effort of genuine comprehension. That understanding, the real kind, not the tactical kind, is what changes everything. Not just in how she experiences you, in how you experience her. In what becomes possible between two people who are actually trying to see each other clearly. That's what today was about. Not advantage, not leverage, not a better strategy for getting what you want from women, a better capacity for actually knowing one. If this shifted something, if any part of today's conversation gave you a framework you didn't have before, share it with someone who's been navigating this without one. Like it if it landed, subscribe because there's more ahead. The woman you want to understand isn't a puzzle to solve. She's a person to know. And knowing takes time, attention, and the genuine willingness to be changed by what you find.